So thank you for joining us today. My name is Megan McLaurin, and I'm the programming coordinator at Interaccess. For those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, Interaccess is a gallery and production studio based in Toronto dedicated to supporting emerging and experimental practices in new media art. Interaccess is located in Toronto on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Interaccess is in the city's Davenport neighborhood. Davenport Road maps the ancient Indigenous trail that linked Indigenous settlements with hunting and fishing grounds and trade routes along Lake Iroquois, which predated what is now Lake Ontario. Toronto's in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. So at Interaccess, we acknowledge this treaty, but we also remain critical of the ways in which it's largely been breached by settlers and newcomers. And as uninvited guests on this territory, we'd like to commit to the work of renewed Indigenous sovereignty. So with this being an online event, I know a lot of you folks will be joining us from places outside of Toronto. So I encourage you to learn about the Indigenous territories and treaties and languages across and beyond Turtle Island at native-land.ca. And before handing things over to our speaker today, Tamiko, I would like to welcome Carrie Liao, who is the curator of our current augmented reality exhibition, Geofenced. Carrie is, the organizer of this event, put all of this together. And so I'm excited to have her here to share a few words about the show and to introduce Tamiko. So I'll hand things over to you, Carrie. Take it away.
Great. Thanks, Megan. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon for some, and I guess good evening for others. My name is Carrie Liao, as Megan mentioned, and I'm the curator of Geofenced. This artist talk is being presented in conjunction with that show. Geofenced is an exhibition born out of a desire to learn more about augmented reality as an artistic medium and how contemporary artists are currently using the technology in their artistic practices. I was also intrigued by the potential of AR to make the public more aware of and engage with their surroundings. In addition to being a curator, I work at Snapchat as a content strategist. And at the time of the show's conception back in 2019, I felt that some of the AR work being produced from the collaborations between tech companies and art institutions weren't fully taking advantage of what the AR medium had to offer in terms of aesthetics, site specificity, and audience participation. I approached 5 artists, Scott Benisinabandan, Kat Bloomkey, Jonathan Carroll, Adrian Mathuzek, and Jen E. Norton, each with varied experience working with AR technology to create new AR work in consideration of geography and the landscape. This resulted in an exhibition that explores how AR alters the environment, either by making spaces more accessible or creating new barriers. In my research of AR work, I came across Tamiko Thiel's pioneering AR practice. As a seminal digital artist with an extensive history working with AR technology as a way of creating art interventions in public spaces, her body of work was well aligned with the themes explored in this exhibition. We are very fortunate to host Tamiko Thiel, and it is my honor and pleasure to introduce her. Tamiko Thiel received the 2018 SAT Montreal Visionary Pioneer Award for now over 35 years of media artworks exploring place, space, the body, and cultural identity in political and socially critical artworks. She was lead product designer of the Connection Machine CM1, CM2, 1986-1987 AI supercomputer, in 1989, the fastest computer on Earth, and since 2016 in the collection of MoMA, New York. In 2020, she returned to her AI roots with the deepfake art installation, Lend Me Your Face. Her first VR was as producer creative director of Starbright World from 1994 to 97 with Steven Spielberg, and her own VR work, Beyond Manzanar, in 2000, which might be the first VR work acquired by a US art museum in 2002 by the San Jose Museum of Art. Her first AR, Art Critic Face Matrix, with an emphasis on AR and art, in 2010 was in the path-breaking AR intervention into MoMA, New York, followed by Shades of Absence in the 2011 Venice Biennale intervention. In 2018, the Whitney Museum commissioned her AR art, Unexpected Growth, now in the collection. And in 2021, the Smithsonian Institution commissioned her AR artwork, Rewild AR, or Rewilder, for its 175th anniversary. So without further ado, welcome Tamiko. So great to have you here with us.
Thanks so much for the invitation. And I've, since you'll have some people in the audience who've made AR and some people who have not done anything with it, then I thought I'd give a little bit of an overview and also show things not just from my own practice, but from various friends and hit some sort of milestones along the history of AR art. So I will share the screen if we're good for that.
Yep, go ahead.
And take it away here. Okay, because because as my bio photo, I used a photo of me in front of the connection machine. I thought I should at least mention that I did start out as a product design engineer, and it was actually while working on this project where I had really carte blanche to do whatever I wanted with the appearance of the machine, as long as it looked fantastic. After having that sort of brief as a 26-year-old designer, you could, I asked myself, what is there left to do? And said, I want to now do this sort of thing full time, which for me meant coming to Europe to study art. And since I graduated in 1991, I've been working as an artist. So augmented reality actually has been around for longer than we think. It was apparently first invented in 1900. And like so much of media art technology, it was invented by the US military in order to, shoot aircraft down. This technology is still being used as heads-up displays, essentially where you're projecting data and information on the windshield of either an airplane, as is depicted here, or if you've ever driven in some of the more expensive cars, then there's also heads-up displays being projected on the inside of the windshield. So augmented reality in that sense is really the real world overlaid with data. The data can be in the form of numbers. As an artist, it tends to be either sound or visuals. Now, in 2000, I've been working in AR as an art form since 2010, but until 2016, it was really very difficult to explain it to people because no one really knew what it was. And then all of a sudden, 2016, Pokemon Go came out, had a huge fan base. This was basically the company Google and all of the information it had been collecting for years already on its Google Maps, saying, okay, the part of the company we call Niantic, a gaming sort of GPS-based gaming company, gets to get our entire database of interesting locations and create a game out of that. And if you were around in 2016, you might have run into these sort of massive run-togethers of people playing Pokemon Go. So after that point, it got a lot easier explaining to people what it was. But my work really draws very heavily on my father, Philip Thiel's thoughts about dealing with the urban environment. And I wanted to just plant the seed so that you can maybe look at the pieces that are coming up with that in mind. He divided the space into, or he divided the environment around us into the concept of space, which he defined as being the physical boundaries, whether walls or floors, ceilings, objects, screens that we could look through. place, which are the details that make it one space different from another. You can think of a theater, for instance, a stage on a theater, how the same physical space of the stage gets turned into completely different environments, different places, depending on what the stage set is. And then he talks about the scene, what is happening with the environment around and the people around, and the occasion, sort of what is happening there right now. The same scene could be having a party, or it could be having a revolution. It could be a very, very different occasion because of what's happening there. So keeping these points in mind as we go through these artworks. The earliest AR public artwork in a sort of a mobile, more or less mobile fashion that I've been able to dig up was 2008, Julian Oliver Artvertiser, where he took, he was using image tracking, where he could use at that point a bit more primitive image recognition AI than what we have now in our smartphones, but it could recognize the image and then place his own content over that. So this type of image tracking AR had kind of a big debut in 2012 in the context of Art Basel in Miami, where the Wynwood Walls Graffiti Art Center, if you will, then commissioned a number of artists to make murals, which were then augmented. I wanted to, okay, I thought I could play this as video, but guess not. Okay, we'll skip over. And then there were people like Mark Skwarek, who in 2009, this is, remember, right after the smartphones have come out, the iPhones, and he was doing image recognition AR like this one, where after the big Deep Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, if you scanned the BP logo, then you'd get a pipe spitting out oil into your environment. So I knew Mark from VR circles, and then and he was in touch with Sander Wienhof, a Dutch artist who was creating geolocative AR. So here he has, Sander had created this installation of cubes. He calls it the biggest and largest interactive sculpture in the world, implying that it spanned the globe. What basically what this does is it looks at your smartphone and says, ah, there you are. I'm going to put the sculpture above you. But what he did have was that his server would allow you to change the color. And when it changed the color for yours, it would also then change the color for everyone else around. So this is using geolocative, using GPS to position it not at a specific place, but at your smartphone, wherever you are in the world. Now, it turns out that Mark and Sander got it into their heads to use this technology to stage an intervention at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And Mark sent me an email about a week before they were going to do this and said, hey, we're getting all of our friends together, send some 3D content, we'll put it up as augments for you in MoMA. We haven't asked their permission. They can't prevent us from doing this. We're doing it of our own accord, because this technology allows us to surmount the institutional walls that usually keep art in and artists out. So this was, of course, a lovely idea. They organized the flash mob there. I couldn't go, but I sent them some content. The Art Critic face matrix, so a matrix of these distorted faces of my own that seem to be screaming, this is not art, it never can be, it never will be. And out of this, we formed the group Manifest.ar with Sander, Mark, myself, other people, Craig Freeman and Will Pappenheimer, being my most closest colleagues, and I'll be showing some of their work also. So this was an incredibly energizing event when we realized we could now put artworks wherever we wanted in the world. And it turns out that MoMA actually found out the day before it was supposed to happen, because it was actually a published part of the Conflux Festival of Psychogeography. So what did they do? They very kindly tweeted it. And that was, of course, the best publicity we could get. So with that, we were really off and running. We formed our group Manifest.ar. George Fifield, the Boston Cyber Arts director, gave us our first invited show at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston in April 2011. And we had really people in numerous different countries. So it was always, some people could go there in person, some people would participate remotely. So after doing MoMA, the next question was, well, how do we top that? And since I live in Munich, which is only a 6.5-hour, very gorgeous train ride to the Alps to Venice, I go to Venice for the biennial every time I can. So I said, hey, I'm going to lead an intervention into the Venice biennial. Who wants to come? So about 8 of us participated. And it turned out that we weren't the only one who had this idea. So Simona Lodi, in the colorful top here, the director of the Share Festival in Turin, Italy, was also there with her group. We banded together to solve the question of how do you get people to look at invisible art that they don't even know is there. So we made this flyer together with both her intervention and our intervention, and then held little flash mobs in the Piazza San Marco and in the Giardini, invited our combined network, so that we got actually a lot of journalists coming and covering the event. And so between the MoMA event and the Venice Biennial intervention, we got into, frankly, the media art history books, and we're off and running. So just very quickly, this is one of the pieces I did for our Venice intervention. A work on censorship. They're standing in this pavilion of words of censorship, and the artists are erased here to represent their works in public space that were censored, including a couple of artists who were censored at various Venice biennials. John Craig Freeman did a work, Water Wars. There was a lot of refugees coming to Europe at that point, as they are now, and as there will be more and more in the future. Craig wanted to really highlight the point that, the city Venice that was formed by refugees escaping onto the water will be one of the stops for the people fleeing the water wars as water becomes a more scarce commodity. So Craig does these really wonderful 3D renderings. So he built these sort of accommodations for refugees and placed them in the middle of Piazza San Marco. Sander did this interesting piece where he created a separate app where you could either be inside the Giardini, sort of protecting it from incursion, or if you were outside the Giardini, then through this map, you could place new pavilions for countries that don't have pavilions in this very highly regulated art space of the Giardini. And it turns out there was a Dutch company that was showing things on large screens. And so Sander, besides our intervention, also got this lovely large screen display of his project that was cycling with the other projects they were showing there. So at some point, before I had been doing these virtual reality works where I would spend a couple of years building up a site, whether it was an internment camp or the city of Venice or the city of Berlin doing the Berlin Wall. And after spending a couple of years building a site, I could then start playing with it in a virtual reality. And I realized that this sort of site-specific intervention was what really interested me. And with AR, I could do it not in 2 years or 5 years, but in, for instance, 2 hours. So when I was in Lisbon, for instance, I realized that the hotel I was staying at was just a couple blocks away from the square called Largo do Carmo, where I knew in 1974, the Carnation Revolution began. And this is when parts of the army actually pushed against the military dictator, but to show that they had peaceful intent, that they were trying to depose the dictator in order to institute a democracy, which still holds today, they put carnations in the barrels of their guns. So it became called the Carnation Revolution. And within an hour or two, I found the carnation on the internet and set up this rain of falling carnations that I geolocated in the square. So this is a way, in the beginning, we didn't have really a lot of processing power on the smartphones. So I was really interested in using very minimal ways to create a relationship between the layers of history, the connotations, the denotations of a site, and visualizing that in an augmented reality artwork. So Craig and some other people, a group that calls itself Four Gentlemen, worked together to create this statue of the goddess of democracy that was created by people in Tiananmen Square, and then of course was destroyed as the demonstration was squashed. So Four Gentlemen put that geolocated that sculpture of the goddess of democracy back in Tiananmen Square, and also recreated the tank man image, the lone man with his shopping bags full of groceries, who just stood in front of a tank and said, if you're going to roll on to destroy the demonstration, you'll have to destroy me first. We don't know what happened to him, but these are being placed from afar in the locations, in the GPS locations. It does beg the question, what happens if someone is standing there and looking at this on their smartphone and some guard sees them? They could very well get in trouble for looking at invisible art in the wrong place at the wrong time. So AR, geolocative especially, allows us to place whatever we want, wherever we want it, but it's quite possible that there still could be problems for people who look at that art in the wrong place at the wrong time. Another piece done by Craig Freeman and Mark Swarek were peace gates, again in a divided city in Belfast, where they were trying to visualize the possibility of moving back and forth through these two sections of the city at a point where there was no physical way to get through them. So we all think of augmented reality really as a way of visualizing things on site, on that particular site, that are not there, that used to be there, that could be there, that we hope could be there in the future. And it really makes a much more compelling experience when you're at the site and you have what seems to be a really solid doorway in front of you, for instance, as in this piece. Another thing that Craig is doing now has been doing these large LiDAR scans where instead of building them in 3D, he scans from one city and places that in a different city. So different types, different ways of working. Will Pappenheimer, also in Manifestar, developed an app together with Zachary Brady, where on an iPad, you could write a message, and then that message would then be visualized above you as a virtual skywriting. So he's participated in various demonstrations where with this, where he lets people write their own messages and then take screenshots of it. Lilian Honglei, in a very different vein, a cultural vein, have this series of butterfly lovers, famous lovers from Chinese mythology, that they place in various locations around the world, for instance, in Times Square. So again, transposing their own Chinese culture to foreign places, foreign lands. So in 2011, Mark organized a AR Occupy Wall Street. That's when the real demonstrations were happening in Wall Street, because people were really fed up with how, after the big financial crash, the banks were saved, the bankers were saved, but all the people, for instance, who lost their mortgages because of the bad banks, had no help whatsoever. So the protests were virulent enough so that they barricaded them. You can see the barricades here. And so Mark put out a call to all of us to send in AR that he would then record on site. So his personal piece was to have people send in a photograph of themselves holding up a protest sign, and then he would cut them out and place them at that site. I created a work that I call Rain of Gold, a rain of falling gold coins. So here it is in front of the stock exchange. Here's a street view where you see the barricades, where apparently you needed a tie to be able to go in there, and they really had mounted police, and you were not allowed to demonstrate there. But I think of these, this type of AR, which I then made available all over the world, again, just like in an earlier piece by Saunders, where he looked to see where you are and then said, okay, I will set the AR at that position. I'm doing the same thing here with Rain of Gold, so that people can protest not only in Zuccotti Park, where the demonstrations had been moved by the policemen, but also in Berlin. There were demonstrations happening really around the world at that point. So here's a screenshot from the protests in Berlin. And then I got these ones from Warren Armstrong, another one of our Manifest.ar members, who's in Australia and Sydney. And then here's the same technique, but in a very, very different type of art piece. So again, a rain of gold coins, but this is a participatory public art piece where I asked people, how much do you need to be happy? And I asked them to write their answer on this whiteboard. And then I would take an AR photograph of them with the coins falling. So, people obviously wrote very different things. I printed these out with a little pocket printer that I had. So the images are about the size of a credit card, and I would give a copy of that to the participant as their good luck charm. And for the gentleman here against the orange background, he wrote in German, heute kein Glück, today no luck. Well, it turns out exactly where the coins fell eradicated the word no. So his sign said, today, luck. So I said, this is really your good luck charm. Take this and don't lose it. So again, taking the same sort of structure, but using it in a very different way, and then also printing out this physical remembrance of that participation for the participant to take home with them. I want to talk about some community projects that I did together as AR art advisor. You might know East Harlem better under the name Spanish Harlem. There's some very famous songs about it. It's the part of the entire New York 5 boroughs that actually is the poorest and the most violent. But back in 2012, when I met the head of the Caribbean Cultural Center and African Diaspora Institute, at a point when in art panel discussions, people were saying, oh, this smartphone stuff is so elitist, and augmented reality on a smartphone, that is, there'll only be a very small number of people worldwide who will ever be able to look at that, because who's going to own a smartphone? But at that point, Marta Morena Vega, the director of the CCC ADI, heard me talk about this technique and said, this is amazing. This is the way that we can take our Caribbean African culture and put it on the streets where that culture happened, where that history happened, where the people live, where the community lives. And, she said, everyone's going to end up getting a smartphone. And if you say to kids, they can see their own culture, their own history on their own streets, they're going to look at that. They're not going to go to a white cube gallery. They're not going to pay $25 to go to the Met or to the Metro or to the MoMA or Whitney, but they will look at their own work on their own streets. So we got a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation. And I taught about 8 artists or so how to use the technology. We were using the Layer app and then the Blipper app. And for instance, Oliver Rios grew up in the area, was a graffiti artist, and recorded not only his own graffiti paintings, but also the graffiti that was being done by other people. So he had this whole store of photographs of works that were no longer there. So he went around East Harlem and used AR to put those images back on the sites where they used to be. And then Yasmin Hernandez created this installation in the middle of the Taino Towers. The Taino are the indigenous peoples of what's now called Puerto Rico. And East Harlem is largely Puerto Rican, New Yorican, you might have heard of. So she was taking the old Taino culture of these batallas, the ceremonial gathering spaces that are surrounded by these carved rocks with these symbols, and putting it into the social housing tower, the courtyard of the tower, where the residents were primarily Puerto Rican Americans. So they asked me to do a piece as well to augment really the facade of the building itself, of the new headquarters for the CCC ADI. Now, I don't come from that community. So I was sitting there saying, well, how can I do this? Because I don't, I can't just put my own work on top of that. So I asked them to send out a questionnaire asking people to write down in their own handwriting what makes El Barrio feel like home for you, and sign their name to it. And then I cut those out in Photoshop, turned them into gold, by the way, registers very nicely on a very large range of different colored backgrounds. And so when you scan the facade, then you would be surrounded by these statements from the community talking about why El Barrio feels like home. I did actually a little bit earlier a similar project looking at my own personal history as a Japanese American in the Seattle Pacific Northwest area. So together with my mother, who is a calligraphy master, we selected 18 sites that had meaning for us, either for our family personally or for us as Japanese Americans. And then invoking my mother's calligraphy, I scanned her calligraphy and would put them on those different sites. And here we had a small gallery space in the Wing Luke Museum. And if you see here in this inset, we had an iPad on a turning swivel so that you would see my mother's calligraphy and then the layer of the augmented calligraphy on top of that. And then to bring some of those 18 sites into the gallery, I also made screenshots on site and printed out and displayed a number of those pieces there. So there are places, for instance, like the Seattle Center with the famous Space Needle and the International Fountain that seem to have no connection to Japanese American history, but it turns out that one of the architects on the Space Needle was the architect who invited my father to come to University of Washington and teach in Seattle. And the fountain, the International Fountain, was designed by young Japanese architects who came and talked to us while we were still in Japan, saying, "What is this crazy place, Seattle, and will our design fit there?" So you invoking the East Asian landscape painting traditions of enhancing landscape paintings with calligraphy, I then did a AR version, putting my mother's calligraphy up on these landscape sites. And I think I need to go a little bit faster, so I'll just skip over. There's a lot of sites that seem to have no connection, and when I delved in, there was a lot of very strong connection to the Japanese history, and even the China Gate, which of course is a different culture from my Japanese background. But the China Gate leads into what used to be called Japantown, and then the Japanese were expelled in World War II. And it became populated with Chinese. So the gate symbolizes both the status of Japanese Americans as insiders and outsiders in what's now called Chinatown. And those are the characters that I've superimposed here, as well as, of course, very sort of like prosaic looking buildings, which, however, Busch Gardens was a banquet hall where all of the big banquets in the Japanese American culture were held. So this way of marking different sites with a cultural marker, then I was invited by an old friend of mine, Susan Hayase, who lives in San Jose, to teach their group down there how to also create AR. So, oh, this is a video. So here's a piece I did as a demonstration, America Monogatari, an American story, with animated cherry blossom logos in the center of Japantown. It turns out that my maternal great-grandparents immigrated to the area. My grandmother was born there back in 1909. And so it was wonderful to come back to this area that was also part of my family history and teach the 9 selected artists how to create their own works. And the difference here was that, the Mi Querida Barrio, the project in East Harlem, was using a commercial app. So our pieces came out in 2016, and 2 years later, they were not working anymore because the company went out of business. So here, in the meantime, my husband, Peter Graff, had created an app that is our own app. We've made it open source. It's called Arpoise. And this is the first group that has used Arpoise to make their own content, besides all the works that I've been doing with it. So here's the work of Lucien Kubo, Winds of Change, Legacy of Sansei Activism. And I really encouraged the artists to don't try and sort of learn a whole new way. Take your existing art and see if we can transfer that into AR. And so a lot of the artifacts that she collected made it in here, the images that she created, and then she had help from a media artist to also do these animated koi and these flowing lines. So I think it's very important not to say, you don't have to force yourself into for instance, working in 3D. If you're used to working in 2D, then use that. You can place 2D elements in 3D space and create a very, very rich atmosphere. You know, I think I'm going to skip over some of the technical stuff. I suspect that you've looked at some of these large sponsorships where corporations have gotten famous artists to make works and with more or less sometimes very beautiful works. Sometimes you sort of say I'd prefer to see the real work. So this is these are all sort of 3D pieces being placed with the SLAM technology. I wanted to go a little bit more into theory right now. This is a work that Phoebe Mann had done in Hong Kong that I thought was really interesting, where she was playing around with scale and saying size does matter. You're measuring everything with respect to your body. So the scale that you make it changes your relationship to that work. Here you see a person, so to speak, seeming to try and push over this monster letter. So think of scale when you work on that. That kind of guys, excuse me, that was a spurious thing. Do we want to? We have 20 minutes. Carrie, should I go over some of my environmental pieces, or do we want to stop and ask questions?
I mean, I'm kind of curious to see some of your environmental pieces, maybe just like one or two.
Okay, I'll skim through a couple of them quickly. All right, so this is actually one of the first ones I did in 2012, searching for Silicon Valley. We were supposed to do something for the 01 biennial with the corporations in Silicon Valley. I stumbled across this Greenpeace study. How clean is your cloud? What % of these server farms serving the cloud are actually using renewable energy? And back in 2012, it was miserable. Apple, 15.3%. So I've floated these clouds on a scale ranging from pitch black to brilliant green over each building. So this is 15.3% green. Google is actually one of the better ones, 39.4% was, and you can see it's almost green, but not quite. It turns out I went looking a couple of years ago to see if Greenpeace had done a follow-on study, and they had, and they said actually most of these companies are now up to, at least they claim, 100% renewable energy for their server farms. So that pressure from Greenpeace and that publicity seems to have really helped. I'll do a quick jump through commission that Will Pappenheimer and I did, Biomer Skelters. In fact, Liverpool using biosensors. Here we're recording the heart rate. Will got some money from his university to create an app. You could be an indiginator planting native plants or an exoticator planting invasive plants. And we were monitoring your heart rate. And when you had your heart rate in harmony with the city, not too fast, not too slow, then every 10 seconds as you walked through the city, you would plant a copse of plants. Here the exoticators, and here the work of a indiginator. And here's the map showing how much we planted in Liverpool. So starting to look at those climate change issues, I came across this Wikipedia geologic temperature record, which made me realize that if we do hit this 2 or 3 degree temperature rise, we are back to temperatures that haven't been on the Earth in the last 6 million years. And they say we are already at the point that last existed 3 million years ago. Homo sapiens is 200,000 years old. That means we have already generated a world with conditions that the human race has never encountered before. So back around in 2015, when I first came across this, no one was talking about this. So I started feeling like I need to start focusing some work on this, because we are in deep yogurt and we're not going to get out of it without changing something radical. So when I got the commission from the Seattle Art Museum Olympic Sculpture Park, I proposed Gardens of the Anthropocene, taking native plants that were fairly likely to be able to survive the immediate shifts, and then mutate them in strange ways. So for instance, these pink farewell to spring flowers, I turned into sort of a Venus flytrap-like thing with these antennae in the middle. And when you look directly at them in the app, they will expand and seem to engulf you, to suck then the radiation out of your smartphone. And then flying above your head are these sort of whirligig bullwhip kelp that, of course, normally are floating with their fronds on the surface of the water. So I'm visualizing a huge rise in storm surge, and all of these signs, all this debris is what they're feeding off of in the storm surges that are coming to us in the future. And what's the best way I've found yet to publicize invisible art? These wonderful 7-foot tall kiosks that the museum built for me in the 2 entrances to the park, with number 1, a photo showing, or a screenshot showing, what you will see if you take the trouble to download the app onto your smartphone, and then of course quick directions how to do that. And people just walked past them, looked at those images, whipped out their phones, downloaded the app, and then were stopping passerby saying, hey, you've got to look at this. So it's really, really important. If you've got invisible art, you've got to somehow make it interesting and attractive for people to look at. I'm going to skip over a couple of things here. I'll touch briefly. 2018 was the year I got a Whitney Commission. That was also the year, as I mentioned, when the commercial apps I had been working with died out. And so my husband, Peter Graff, who's a multimedia and server developer, was able to write an app, and we were able to carry out the commission. So here I put the Whitney underwater, and put this colorful coral reef on the terrace. And if you look closely, however, the actual corals are made out of virtual plastic garbage. And here, another way to present it, the Whitney had then large iPads set up to look out onto the terrace, so you could pick those up if you didn't have a smartphone yourself. And then there were instructions for you to how you could download the app and then go out onto the terrace and walk around more. So another couple of modalities, but I really I insist on having some sort of image of what you will see if you take the trouble to download the app. Otherwise, it's an uphill battle. I'm starting to work now with AR projections. So this one was really taking a piece we call Evolution of Fish, that you can guide around, but if you move them around too much, they turn into plastic waste. We projected them on these large buildings, and because it's an AR app, an AR projection, anyone standing in front of the iPads we had set up in this little square would also appear to be part of the artwork. And we had lines really going around the block. But the whole idea here, of course, is that as you interact with it, you're turning it more and more into plastic waste. So you are having a direct influence on the what's happening with the plastic garbage and with the environment. And I think, yeah, hey, that's the end anyway. So I'm going to stop sharing, and thank you for listening.
Tamiko, thank you so much. You are so accomplished, and you have such a large body of work that really has a breadth of experimenting with the medium. I feel like you've done it all, really.
Oh no, there's lots of stuff coming out. I'm just amazed at what people are producing now, that it's fairly common and fairly easy to do. There's just gorgeous stuff being made.
Oh, that's very humble. Okay, so I'm going to turn it to the audience for some questions. And we do have one question from Kat Blimke, who's actually one of the artists exhibiting in the show Geofenced. And her question is, I'm curious about your experience with the reception / interest for AR work internationally, as you live in Germany, but have done projects all over Europe and the US. Have you worked with Canadian institutes before? Where is the largest audience for AR work from your experience?
Yeah, I think there's different levels of that. Especially in the beginning, it was very clear that Asian audiences were much more receptive to AR, to media art in general. It was just much more of a part of their culture. You know, I'm trying to remember when the first time I saw, smartphones in wide use was in Taipei, 2000. Maybe that was like 2000 or something like that, and that was way before it was used in the States or in Europe. So I think I mentioned in 2012. I was in these discussions where people were talking about how elitist smartphones are and how no one in the world is going to ever have a smartphone. So how can you show work on that platform? And I was laughing at them, but they didn't believe me. So that's one aspect, is how widely permeated is a smartphone culture in the environment. And you do get people who are just really resistant. You're saying, oh, take a look at this, and they're going like, keep that away from me. I find with tablets, the larger the better. It's much different, because it's also like older people might not be able to see the image very well, and so there's no sense in them trying. But if you can, if you're doing your flash mob in public and you have large iPads where it's very visible, I think there the reception is a lot better. And I've been very interested actually to find that when I give AR tours, the people who show up for the tours tend to actually be older people who they might have actually very good devices, but they don't know what the password is because their daughter always does the app store stuff for them, but they're really interested. And if you can show them stuff on a large tablet, then they're quite excited. So I think more than saying, where is the audience biggest, it's a matter of setting up your presentation to accommodate people who are younger people who have already exceeded their data allowance and are not going to get more data and can't download your 50 megabyte app or your 150 megabyte app or your 350 megabyte app. And then, tourists who might not have much connectivity, or it's going to be really expensive for them, or people who don't know their password and therefore can't download it, or people who can't see that small screen. Or those are the categories of exclusion or inclusion. And so the other point I mentioned of having some image showing people what they can expect if they take the trouble, those are the factors that make the difference, and not really the exact where you are in the world or in what sort of people are around you. I sincerely believe that in my experience.
That's amazing insight, because one of the main criticisms I always hear about digital art, VR, AR, like really anything having to do with technology, is that it's very inaccessible. No one knows how to use it. It's always broken. But, I don't think that is that responsibility is entirely on the artist. It's true that the audience themselves must educate themselves how to use it, or just even be open to troubleshooting and things like that. And tech companies as well need to improve the accessibility. Like you said, things are very small on like the iPhone. How do we make it bigger? So there's like some issues there that need to be addressed.
Yeah.
So I see Megan said we only have 5 minutes, but there are 2 questions, so I will ask them.
Yes.
So from Mimi, with the new web XR being rolled out on most mobile browsers, people won't need to download apps anymore. How do you see AR art and public interaction with them going forward?
Yeah, well, I think that step of not having to download an app does make a big difference at the point where that becomes really workable. Then my husband and I might have to rethink whether we want to continue with our own app. But I think just in general, both Apple and Google are really pushing AR, and at their big presentations for several years now have been saying AR is the future, AR is the future, AR is the future. So I think with that huge push coming from them, with it becoming much more accessible, I think basically at this point anyone can take a photograph or make a video. That was not true 10 years ago. 10 years ago, 2011, smartphones were not around so much. So no, not everyone had a camera in their pocket all the time. But so that sort of progress really does make a huge difference. And I think, in 10 years, I think AR will be just pretty common. But that also brings up the question of, does that mean that you're going to have advertising flashing all around you? And there's this great video done by Keiichi, I forget his last name, a Japanese guy, that shows that sort of oversaturation. Is that where we want to go? We have to
absolutely
figure that out.
That's the concern, and hopefully the public will be able to push back, and policymakers will be on our side as well.
We shall see.
See.
There was a second question, I think.
That's right. From Kuchi, have you worked on anything with AR projection that projects on the ground or from above? How did you place the projector? It's a very technical question.
I mean, projector really in the sense of a device that projects light on an object. I mean, there was the one thing that I showed where we were projecting on the facades of the building. Those were, of course, very strong projectors. I'm actually opening a piece next week in Regensburg, a town about an hour away from here, where we're in a sort of a tunnel. It was in the main train station. It's an underpass that used to be used to get to the platform. So there, we'll have 6 projectors, and actually several of them are going to be the old VGA projectors that will just be projecting video into the wall. And then, otherwise we've got 4 HDMI. The iPhones and the iPads have an HDMI signal out that you can just plug directly into the projector. Some Androids do, but you have to look really carefully because lots of times they don't work. I've had a lot of problems, and at some point we just said, okay, we just specify it has to be an iPhone or an iPad, and then it'll work. But that works really nicely, and you can set up. I've done it a lot of times, setting up an iPad on a tripod or on a pedestal. And then you've got this framed image, and people says, oh, it's a framed image, it must be art. I will go and look at it because I'm trained to look at art, and then walk over there, and they'll realize it's AR. So again, you're lowering the barrier. You're saying, like, okay, you're used to looking at art on pedestals. Well, here's art and an iPad that's on a pedestal, and by golly, it looks like art.